There are different ways to trigger Firebase Cloud Functions. We could trigger them when a document or a database changes, or when there is a new created user or a user just logs in. And also, and perhaps the most common one, we can call them directly like regular HTTP functions. Right now, we're going to see the two ways we have to call HTTP functions. First, we have the onRequest handler. This one gives us a regular HTTP function that takes in a request and then sends a response. We can access different properties from the request. For example, we can get the request body if we are sending an HTTP post request, or we can access the URL params if we are sending a GET request, and we can even access which method it is that the user is sending. And from there, we can do different things. For example, let's say we want the function to only take post requests. We can come in and ask, okay, is this a post request? And if so, then we execute our logic. And if not, we can immediately say, okay, we're going to send back the response. It's going to have a 400 status, and the error message is going to be, okay, this is a bad input. Or maybe you can be more specific and say something like, we only allow post requests. And in here, we can access different other things. Like, for example, once we are here, we want to check if there is a property called token in the body, and if that token is equal to whatever super secret token I have stored in my backend. If so, then I'm going to send back the response. This time it was a positive response with no errors. And after whatever operation we are doing on our backend, we are going to send the message back to the user like it worked. And again, if there is no token or the token is not equal to the one I have stored in my backend, then we can send a different response. This time we have a different HTTP code, and the message can be something like, you are not our user, bad hacker. And this is a regular HTTP call. It's going to have the request. You're going to send back the response. For a long time, this was the only way we had to send the HTTP calls to Firebase. But since a lot of those calls are coming from client-side applications, the Firebase team created a new trigger called onCall. This one, similar to the onRequest, is going to be an HTTP call. But since it's meant to be used from your client application, then you're going to access the data and send the response a bit differently. For example, we have here our callable function. Instead of taking in a request and having the response to send, it's going to have an options object. From this object, we can access things like the data, and data is whatever you're sending from your client application, or auth, that it's going to have the authentication data. And here I can check, for example, if there is a user ID, then there is someone logged in. If not, then I know that the request is coming from someone that it's not logged in. And in here, instead of sending a response with a status, we are going to directly throw a new HTTP error. We are going to say it's a failed precondition because we want one of the conditions the user needs to meet to be able to talk to this API is that they have to be authenticated. And here we can do more things before returning whatever we want to return to our user. For example, I want to ask if there is a property called team ID inside the data, and if the team ID is a string. If so, we are going to, instead of sending a response with a status, we are going to directly return, and we are going to say, for example, it works, and we are going to send back the data just because we want. If not, we can throw a new HTTP error, and this one can be an invalid argument. And we can tell the user, okay, you need to send a team ID and it has to be a string. From this data, you can get whatever properties that you are sending, so make sure to validate that the properties exist. And from the auth object, we can actually get more items. For example, we have the UUID, but from the auth.token, we can also get the user's name, their picture, and their email. There are different ways that people decide which one to use. Some people just use onRequest for everything. In my case, I like to think is where am I going to call this function from? If I'm going to call it from a different service, like a different backend, I'm just going to directly use an onRequest. I'm going to send a token and I'm going to validate it and I'm going to do whatever it is that my function needs to do there. But if I'm calling it directly from my JavaScript application, like if I have an Angular application, an Ionic application, I always find myself using the onCall. That's because the onCall does not only have this backend method, but it also has a client-side SDK. So when you use the client-side SDK to call the on-call functions, you don't have to worry about authentication. You don't have to worry about headers. You really don't have to worry about making the HTTP request. You're just going to call that method from the SDK. You're going to send the data, and the method is going to grab the authentication and every other metadata it needs to be able to perform that call.